Communication is the foundation of a good relationship. For a lot of parents, it's a challenging task because, let's face it, your teens are sensitive. They take things you say in a critical manner when you're just trying to help them. And sometimes they don't feel like communicating and they close themselves up. So how can you communicate with your teen so that they can listen back at you? And I think a lot of it has to do with your approach, how you approach your teen. So if you think about communication as divided into listening and expressing, I want to talk about the two of them separately, going through some common do's and don'ts. I know many of you have often wondered to yourself, why did he or she pick the worst time to come and talk to me? Because the window of openness to communication is so limited for a teen that I actually encourage parents to try to be as available as they can when their teen wants to talk. So a common time, right after school, when they want to unload what happened during the day. Another time that many teens want to talk and parents do not want to hear from them is bedtime. And why? Well, because they're worried about what's going to happen the next day. And I tell parents, I know you're trying to get your teen to bed, and you think about this behavior that this is actually their manipulation of trying to stay up late. Maybe it's true for some teens, but for a lot of teens, if you can find that 10 minutes, 15 minutes to talk to them, you can be really be able for your teen to open up, because that's a really crucial time. Judging is, I think, a listening block, and the problem with judging is that you lose the nuances. You are so focused on measuring your teen to some kind of a standards, either standards that you think your teen should be doing, or you think, comparing your teen to maybe your other teen, rather than focusing on what your teen wants at that particular moment. Assuming is jumping to conclusions, and everyone does it. But the thing is, even when you are right, you are actually closing the window of communication. Right? Because in your teen, it's like, oh, my parents get me. I don't need to say so many sentences. I'll just say one thing, my parents get it, we move on. If you want to open that window of communication, ask clarifying questions. Ask open-ended questions. Have your teen talk to you. I want you to really think about listening as an attitude. It's an attitude of interest. When I say paying attention, I really mean turning off the TV, putting away your to-do list, putting away your magazine, and just give them that undivided attention, even if it's only for 15 minutes. It's also important for you to pay attention to the nonverbal cues. When parents tell me, the other day, my teen just followed me around the house. Like, I go to the kitchen, my teen's there, looking for water. I go into the living room, my teen's there flipping through magazines. He never does that. What does that mean? And I said, don't ask me, ask your teen. Do you want to talk? I noticed that you're following me around. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about how you've been doing. Nonverbal cues, also in terms of expressions, are very important. And I tell parents to focus on any incongruence between what they are saying and what they're showing on their face. So for example, your teen may be talking to you about their excitement of going to their first dance. But you notice that for some reason, they are very fidgety while they are talking about it. They seem restless, and there's a frown on their face. And maybe by pointing that out, you seem a little nervous or seem a little anxious. What's going on? Your teen might tell you, actually, I'm kind of worried. What if no one asks me to dance? Then what do I do in that moment? Right? So noticing the difference between what they are telling you and what's on their face. Reflective or active listening is basically really seeking to understand your teen and offering the ideas back to them. So it's similar to paraphrasing. And I know a lot of parents have, if you've read any parenting books, they talk about reflective and active listening. In my work with parents, I think the challenge that often parents face in being able to successfully do this is their difficulty in withholding assurance. So when your teen walks in the room and they say, oh my God, my coach hates me, I'll never play soccer again. Your first instinct is to tell your teen, what are you talking about? Your coach loves you. You're always the first out there on practice days. You're putting so much effort. How could that possibly be? right? So you are trying to reassure your teen rather than actually feeding back what they are saying to you. You sound frustrated. What makes you feel like your coach treats you differently from the other team members? So being able to hold off that tendency to reassure your teen will help you to be able to engage in better reflective and active listening. And finally, keep listening about their friends. Their friends will tell you oftentimes more about your teen than what they would tell you about themselves. So their friends' values, their friends' hobbies, how their friends cope with stress are all very important information and gateway for your better understanding of your teen. Talking to a teen can be frustrating because they are sensitive, they might misinterpret things you say, they might challenge things you say. But often when I work with teens and parents, I notice that a lot of the common talking blocks occur because of a parent's desire to help their teen. It is really coming from a place of love. Take nagging, for example. Why would you nag if you're not trying to help your teen out, right? The problem with nagging is that it actually reinforces forgetfulness. Because you nag with the assumption that your teen will not remember to do whatever you are asking them to do. In your teen's mind, he is saying, oh, mom is going to remind me every 2 minutes to brush my teeth. Why do I need to remember? The next common talking block is denying or minimizing. And again, I think that often comes from a place of love, of reassurance. Oh, of course you don't hate your brother. It's not that bad. And in that moment, it might be helpful for your teen to hear that, but it actually has the inadvertent effects of your teen questioning the feelings that he or she has, right? So your teen is starting to kind of feel like he cannot trust himself. He's having all these feelings, but you're telling him it's not true. You can also inadvertently teach your teen that certain emotions are not tolerated in this family. Then your teen will be less likely to bring up those specific emotional conversation with you. No parents does shaming on a conscious level. Sometimes it happens when your stress level is high, when you are also in that moment of a crisis. And I tell parents, just try to remember this is a time when your teen is forming their self-identity, right? So if you know you have a tendency to say things that you might regret later, just hold off, walk away, and think in your head, but walk away and try to do the problem solving when both you and your teens are in a calmer place. Knee-jerk advice, again, your attempts in helping your teen, but it robs them the opportunity of really learning how to problem solve. My hope in terms of why I spend so much time going through all the different changes and going through the developmental tasks is that I think it's actually a good idea for parents to share some of that with the teen. That you know that being a teen is facing multiple changes at one time, and that process is supposed to be stressful, and that you are there for them if they want to talk. It's also important to validate their feelings, and by validating feelings, it's not just recognizing how they are feeling, but oftentimes teens can really use your help in identifying the feeling. So if you give a name to the feeling, whether it's frustration, anger, or disappointment, it actually lends control to them so they feel more able to manage their emotions. Teens actually choose friends who have similar values to their family. So they actually choose friends to reinforce family values. And also, family values can protect teens from peer pressure. And how do you share those values? I tell parents to not sit the teen down on the dining table and lecture to them. Because come on, they spend 6 hours a day in a classroom. Find teaching moments, right? I mean, when you're watching a movie, when you're flipping through the news, when they are talking about their friends. Those are very important moments for you to share. This is how I think about the issue. This is how I was raised. It is very important that you model some of that positive communication. And what I mean by that is try to avoid use of sarcastic language. Try to avoid raising your voices, even though you don't do it to the kids, you just do it to your spouse. just try to avoid modeling those kind of behaviors. And finally, and very importantly, be able to talk about their behaviors separate from their identity. When you use native traits words, so words like lazy, selfish, inconsiderate, these are words that your teen can inadvertently use to label themselves and to actually adopt it as part of their identity. There's actually a big difference between saying you are lazy versus, not doing homework is irresponsible, right? So you're only focusing on the behavior rather than on your teen.